This is disc number 2.
A powerful example of beliefs at work. When school children are encouraged to believe that their bad grades come from lack of effort rather than lack of intelligence, they show remarkable gains in both persistence and accomplishment. Protecting our self-esteem. If being happy requires us to think we're better than average, when we're forced to consider that we did worse than average on a task, we have 100 ways to deny that uncomfortable fact. I wasn't feeling well that day. That test was biased. My mind isn't suited to these silly tests. And as these failure experiences recede into the past, our rationalizations become stronger. In fact, we simply tend not to remember things that made us look bad. Memory is often the overzealous secretary who assists in this process by hiding or destroying files that harbor unwanted information, like Nixon's secretary and the infamous 18-minute gap in the White House tapes. Of course, the same principles are reversed if we are depressed or have a negative self-image. We're not surprised when we make a mistake or are rejected. No cognitive dissonance there. But another motive for self-destructive behavior. If depressed people and those with low self-esteem find that they're successful or that people like them, they tend to feel fraudulent. They don't know the real me. I just got lucky on that test. I'm really not that good. Feeling insecure and fraudulent, they typically reject love or success. Their lovers or admirers are confused and give up on them. It's so important to us to be consistent in our view of ourselves that we deny the evidence of our senses. That's one example of our desire for control. Most of us need to feel that we're in control of things. It makes us all feel safer. One of my favorite examples compared a group of depressed college students to a group who showed no signs of depression. All the students were given a joystick and sat down to play a video game on a monitor. They were not told that, in fact, the joystick didn't work and the game was playing itself at random. The more depressed college students were much quicker to figure this out. They would turn to the experimenter and complain that the controller was broken, while non-depressed students would go on happily fiddling with the stick. This finding has been repeated many times in other situations. Most people develop the illusion of control, while depressed people stick with what's called depressive realism. Depressive realism is more accurate, but it doesn't make you conventionally happy in the long run. Lawyers who are trained to anticipate everything that can go wrong are usually depressive realists and suffer from a high rate of clinical depression. One essential aspect of emotional intelligence is how objective we can be about our own feelings, despite what acculturation, prejudice, inattention, and all the other forces that sway us tell us about how we ought to feel. People vary greatly on this quality. We're even worse at anticipating future emotions. All the happiness research suggests that people are usually way off the mark when they think about what will make them happy in the future. Lottery winners, for example, when asked a year later, are back to their previous level of happiness, if not less so, because they've become the subjects of harassment or seen their friends and family drop away because of jealousy. When we feel certain about something, we like to believe that we've done a thorough job of analyzing the facts, or that our intuition is reliable, that we have good reason to feel the way we do. But now there's evidence to show that certainty is only a feeling like anger or excitement, the result of unconscious forces at work in the brain. If you think for a minute, you can probably dredge up experiences when you were absolutely sure something would happen, but it didn't. You'll probably have to make an effort, though, because we tend to forget incidents like these and prefer to remember when that feeling of certainty did prove to be correct. The effects of effort and expense. We know that the attempt to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time produces anxiety. We really don't like the anxious state, so we distort reality and settle on the one idea that makes us more comfortable. Anything we do that requires a lot of time, effort, and expense will increase in value in our eyes. That may be why hot dogs cooked over a campfire taste so much better than hot dogs at home. The expensive wine always tastes better than the cheap one, even when it's the same wine served in different bottles. In dating, people who play hard to get may seem more attractive to their pursuers. Restaurants increase their profits by adding high-priced dishes to their menus. Few people order the most expensive item, but they are more likely to choose an expensive dish that costs slightly less than the most expensive. In war, the more sacrifices our soldiers make, and the more expensive the war, the more we want to forget that the basic premises of the war were false. The irrevocability of the decision is another important factor. People who have just bet on a horse race are more certain that their horse will win than the people standing in line to place their bets. That's why AA has zero tolerance for drinking. If you have 2 years of sobriety behind you, then take a drink, you're much more likely to keep on drinking because the mere act of taking a drink, an irrevocable decision, will make you suddenly start to discount all the information and experience you have about the value of sobriety. You'll rationalize, I can control my drinking, minimize, a few drinks won't kill me, and deny. Well, I guess I never really was an alcoholic. In a clever experiment, college students were divided into 3 groups, then given a word jumble test. Group A was given SoBe, a drink that's supposed to enhance thinking powers, then watched a video about the virtues of the drink while waiting for its effects to take hold. They were also charged $2.89 for the bottle of SoBe. Group B had the drink and watched the video, but were told the university had received a discount and only charged 89 cents for the drink. The control group had no drink and no video. In the end, Group A, with the more expensive drink, did slightly better than the control group. The surprising finding was that the students who had the discounted drink did worst of all. It seems like the value you attribute to something, more than its inherent value, influences your expectations. And your expectations, to a great extent, influence the life you live. Social influence. We know from many classic psychological experiments that people will go to great lengths to fit in and blend with the crowd. Put into a group where everyone else makes an obvious error in judging the length of a line, almost everyone will go along with the group despite the evidence of their senses. We also have a strong natural desire to be consistent. Once we make a commitment, we feel obligated to follow through, even though we may keep finding unpleasant negative consequences. People will do all kinds of things, some of them self-destructive, to look good to others. Foot binding, stretched necks, tattoos and piercings, plastic surgery, all of which can be carried to extremes. The endless pursuit of fashion, the injuries that come with sports, from pro football to weekend softball. Many teens start drinking, smoking, and drugging in an effort to be cool, to fit in. Even if they don't turn out to be adults with a drug problem, their developing brains are damaged in the process. We can look back on history and marvel at the foolishness that was de rigueur at the time. Dueling, for instance, was practically required of 18th century men because they would not be received in polite society if they didn't rise to a challenge. But honor was satisfied by a minor sword wound. As swords gave way to pistols, and pistols became more accurate, dueling grew much more deadly. But sweeping social change was necessary before it became unfashionable. What will future generations find foolish and destructive in our society that seems to make perfect sense to us now? If social values are healthy, then some aspects of the desire to fit in and look good are useful. Diet and exercise, if they don't get carried to the level of obsession. Smoking has declined greatly in social acceptability over the past decades, to everyone's benefit. Being overweight used to be a sign of status because the poor couldn't afford enough food to be fat. Now being overweight is often associated with being poor because of junk food. Times change. As long as social trends support health and don't go to extremes, they can provide positive motivation for us. Being fit and eating healthy are the fashion right now, all the better for us. Social norms as codified in the law, but also simply public disapproval, also help keep us honest and in control. We tend to be more ethical when we're thinking of others. Lab studies have shown that the feeling of being watched, even with simply a portrait or mirror hung in a room in which the subject is alone, promotes ethical behavior. The subject is less likely to pick up loose change the experimenters have left lying around. A big poster of glaring eyes has been found to deter bicycle theft. So the desire to look good, to fit in, can serve very useful purposes, unless it gets carried to extremes. Yet we often aren't aware of the social pressure we feel. We've referred to the self-serving bias, a broad name for a range of mental habits that protect our self-esteem from painful reality. One particularly self-destructive example is that we tend to think we are less subject to influence than other people. I don't follow the crowd. I don't get taken in by advertising. I make my own political decisions. But the effects of influence can be very subtle. John Bargh, an innovative social psychologist, gave a group of subjects what they thought was a language test. But in one condition, many of the words had to do with aging, while the control group read neutral words. The real experiment consisted of timing the two groups with a stopwatch after they completed the reading. Those who read words associated with the elderly walked down the hall more slowly than the others. Apparently, just reading about aging made their automatic selves feel older. Another experiment had half the group read words associated with rudeness, the other not. When the reading was over, the participants had to turn in their papers to an experimental assistant, who was talking with another colleague. Those who read about rudeness were quicker to interrupt. Bargh had gone on to repeatedly document what he calls the chameleon effect, the unconscious tendency we all have to mimic the actions, feelings, and attitudes of people around us. As you might expect, we're even more likely to imitate people who have higher status, like people on television. And keep in mind that this is done by the automatic self. Though we might consciously emulate someone we like or respect, we are unconsciously susceptible to all kinds of influence we're not aware of. The Milgram experiments mentioned earlier are a famous and frightening example of the power of social influence. Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale, randomly divided college volunteers into two groups, the learners and the teachers, though in fact the learners were in on the experiment and knew what they were supposed to do. The learners were sent to the next room. The teachers were asked to give the learners a simple memory test. For each wrong answer, they were to administer a shock to the learner, gradually increasing in intensity in 15-volt intervals. The teachers were given a sample shock at the lowest intensity, so they would have an idea of what it felt like. The learners followed a script in which they gave a lot of wrong answers. When a shock was administered, a pre-recorded tape played sounds of moaning or complaining. Then the learner would start banging on the wall. When the shock reached a certain level, the learner would complain about his heart condition. Then the learner would go silent. Milgram found that about 65% of his subjects were willing to go up to the maximum shock, 450 volts, even though this was labeled dangerous on the shock box. Most of them were clearly uncomfortable and expressed some reluctance, but the experimenter would say things like, the experiment requires that you continue. Then most of the subjects would comply. The 65% figure has been replicated in many subsequent studies, though there are some cultural differences. Some African and South American countries had a lower obedience rate, but most of Western Europe was in the same range as the U.S. These experiments took place in the early 60s, when the Holocaust was fresh in people's minds. They are generally interpreted to mean that people will violate their own moral standards in obedience to authority, or as in Nazi Germany, when unspeakable acts became the norm. Being subject to influence like this, yet not being aware of its power, can have very self-destructive effects. We are influenced by violence on television and in video games. Watching them increases aggressive behavior, angry feelings, and aggressive thoughts, and decreases helping behavior. In a study that followed participants for 15 years, children who watched more violence on television were 3 times more likely to be convicted of a crime in their 20s. And they were also more likely to abuse their partner and assault other people. Exposure to sexual violence increases the probability that men will use violence against women. Undergoing an experiment in which a gun is merely present in the room will increase the amount of electric shock we are willing to administer to another subject. If we live in a community with a high divorce rate, we're more likely to divorce. If we're unconsciously primed to think about money, we become more selfish, uncooperative, and distant. Unfortunately, just hearing about these facts is unlikely to make you less subject to influence. The self-serving bias will have us forget them in a few days or think, "Thank God I'm not like that." It takes continual effort to build the habit of questioning subtle influence. Practice in mindfulness skills, as described in the next chapter, can help you be more objective about yourself, more aware of the pressures on you to feel and do things that conflict with your own values. Distorting memory. We've already referred to the fact that we tend to remember good things about ourselves and forget things that don't bring us credit. It's worse than that, though. Our automatic selves are good at distorting and even creating memories. Men and women alike remember having had fewer sexual partners than they actually did. They remember having had far more sex with those partners than they actually had, and they remember using condoms more often than they actually did. People also remember voting in elections they didn't vote in. They remember voting for the winning candidate rather than the politician they did vote for. They remember giving more to charity than they really did. They remember that their children walked and talked at an earlier age than they really did. You get the idea. Researchers had a group of undergraduates take a study skills program that was actually ineffective. When the experiment started, the students were asked to rate their study skills. Half were then diverted into a control group in which they received no training. Those who undertook the ineffective course, however, wanting to justify the time they had put into the training, did it by misremembering. They remembered having rated themselves lower on study skills at the beginning than they actually had. 6 months later, they also misremembered their grades in the study skills course, thinking they had received better grades than they really did. The control group, of course, remained steady in their ratings of their own skills. Many of us do the same thing repeatedly over the course of our lives. We remember doing worse in the past, under tougher conditions, to make ourselves feel good about our present selves. Irrational thinking and false beliefs. One assumption that causes a great deal of trouble is that intelligence is a relatively fixed quality, doled out at birth. Remember that the average person thinks he's more intelligent than average. On the contrary, intelligence is a skill that can be learned, just like other skills. We get better at solving problems the more we try. Psychologist Carol Dweck has been working with schools and children for more than 20 years, and she's demonstrated that when she can get students to buy into the belief that intelligence is a skill, not a trait, their performance and motivation improve dramatically. It's the same way with adults. If we've been programmed to believe we can't learn, or that we have low intelligence, as many kids conclude from their school experience, we aren't going to try very hard and will give up easily. We won't feel good about ourselves. These are very self-destructive attitudes, yet they're becoming more and more pervasive in the American working class. I've had the good fortune to work with some people like this who have learned a skilled trade or mastered a self-taught craft in adulthood. They discover that they are capable of learning and can think through problems on their own, and their damaged self-esteem is repaired. Yet these are the fortunate few, as jobs in the skilled trades dry up and flipping burgers becomes the only option. Other comforting illusions that often lead to bad outcomes for us include the planning fallacy. While we can be quite good at predicting the performance of others, we consistently underestimate how long it will take us to complete a project. Students were asked to estimate how long it would take them to finish their theses, giving a best-case scenario and a worst-case scenario. Fewer than half finished by their most pessimistic estimate. The ironic effects of thought suppression. Whenever you try not to think about something, you make it more likely that you will think about it. It's the try not to think of a pink elephant phenomenon. Distracting yourself has been found to be more effective than any effort at thought suppression. So if you're lying in bed at night trying not to think about tomorrow's deadline, try to send your mind elsewhere. Try to remember in detail something pleasant, a vacation or a good movie, for instance. The fundamental attribution error. We judge ourselves by our intentions, but others by their actions. We tend to think other people's mistakes are caused by character flaws, while our mistakes are due to situational factors. I had a headache on the day of the exam, but he's just not very smart. Then we have the opposite. Our good behavior is attributable to fundamental traits, while other people's is temporary and situational. I'm returning this wallet to Lost and Found because I'm a moral and ethical person. Others do so only if they're seen picking it up. Thus we own our strengths and disavow our weaknesses. This is a big obstacle to overcoming self-destructive behavior. It justifies all our attempts to deny or put off the need to change and rationalizes the consequences of our actions. Entrapment. It's likely that the subjects in the Milgram experiments would never have administered what they thought was a potentially fatal shock of 450 volts to the learner in the other room if they had been asked to at the outset. But because they had started out at 10 volts and only increased the shock in small increments, they became entrapped. After all, if you've given a shock of 350 volts, 375 is only 25 more. Where do you stop? In the same way, what's one more cookie, or one more lie, or one more cheat? Confirmation bias. We tend to remember evidence that confirms our beliefs or decisions and ignore or belittle evidence that goes against them. It was recently shown that the brain seems to be wired this way. A study of the brain using new technology showed that the thinking areas practically shut down when people were made to listen to information that contradicted their political beliefs. Conversely, when they heard information that tended to confirm their beliefs, the happiness centers of the brain lit up.